In a quiet park, a homeless man in his early 30s lay resting on a stone bench. Weak with hunger, he came across a wallet stuffed with cash. Instead of keeping it, he quietly returned it to its owner and walked away without a word. The owner, a lonely old man, was stunned by such integrity. He decided to follow him in secret, and what he witnessed afterward would change both of their lives forever. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you watching from. We love to hear your thought. The late afternoon sun sank low over Riverside Park, pouring a soft golden light across the pathways. The leaves had begun to turn amber and deep red, scattering with each gust of cool October wind. Joggers moved past in steady rhythms. A couple of children played near the fountain, their laughter faint against the hush of traffic in the distance. Daniel Carter sat on a bench near the river, his shoulders hunched inside a worn gray jacket. He pulled the zipper up to his chin, though it hardly worked anymore, broken halfway. His shoes were frayed at the edges, the soles peeling away. His stomach growled, and he pressed a hand against it, as if that might silence the ache. He kept his eyes down, watching the cracks in the pavement. The park had become his refuge these past months, a place where nobody asked questions. To most people, he was invisible, a young man who had slipped through the cracks, just another stranger sleeping where he shouldn't. A flicker of brown on the next bench caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a forgotten paper bag, but when the wind lifted slightly, he saw leather glinting in the light. Daniel leaned forward. It was a wallet. He glanced around. The joggers were gone. The children's parents had already gathered them up. No one seemed to notice. His hand moved slowly, cautious, as if reaching for something that might disappear if he touched it too quickly. When his fingers closed around the wallet, he felt the weight immediately. He opened it. Inside were several credit cards, neatly stacked bills, and at least $1,000 in cash. His breath caught. He counted once, twice, his hands trembling. He hadn't held that much money in years. His throat tightened, his stomach growled again, sharper this time, almost cruel. He thought of the corner store down the street, the smell of hot food drifting out when the door opened. Daniel shut the wallet quickly, his palms sweaty. For a moment he stared at the ground, his mind racing. It would be so easy. Just walk away. He needed the money more than anyone he knew. He could get a motel room, a shower, a real meal, maybe even send part of it to pay off the medical debt that had crushed him after his mother's death. But then he pictured her face. His mother's tired smile, the way she had always reminded him, no matter how bad things get, Danny, you do the right thing. That's all a man can hold on to. He swallowed hard, his chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. Slowly Daniel stood. He looked around the park again, searching for anyone who might appear panicked or lost. A man was pacing near the path ahead, his hands patting at his coat pockets. His movements were sharp, nervous. The man was older, white hair combed neatly back, his posture stiff with age but still upright. Daniel walked toward him. "Excuse me, sir," he said, holding the wallet out. His voice cracked from dryness. "Is this yours?" The older man turned, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "Where did you get that?" His tone carried more accusation than gratitude. "On the bench back there." Daniel nodded toward the seat. "Thought you might have dropped it." The man took the wallet quickly, opening it with precise fingers. He flipped through the bills, checked the cards, his jaw tight. He looked up again, his eyes narrowing at Daniel. Daniel didn't flinch. He stood quietly, his hands empty now. His lips curved into the faintest smile, not forced but tired. "You should keep it safe," he said simply. Without waiting for a reply, Daniel turned and walked away. His steps were steady, almost casual, but his chest felt heavy. He didn't want to stay for whatever suspicion or judgment might follow. The man left behind held the wallet against his chest, his brows furrowed as he looked at Daniel's back moving farther down the path. He had expected something, maybe a trick, maybe a demand. But the young man was already gone, fading into the crowd near the park gates. Richard Thompson stood frozen, the autumn wind tugging at his coat. He had lost things before, possessions, deals, money, but this moment unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. His gaze lingered on the spot where Daniel had disappeared, a quiet unease gnawing at him. The park grew quieter. Richard finally tucked the wallet into his jacket pocket. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. Why would anyone? His words trailed off. As he started toward the exit, the sound of children's laughter echoed again across the park, sharp against the silence Richard carried with him. Richard Thompson left the park with his wallet pressed tightly inside his coat. He should have felt relief. The money was there, every bill in its place, the cards were untouched, nothing had been taken. But as he walked back to his town car waiting on the curb, the relief refused to settle. Instead, an uneasiness followed him like a shadow. Inside the car, he sat in silence. His driver glanced at him through the mirror but didn't speak. Richard rested the wallet on his knee and opened it again, counting out the bills even though he knew they were all there. His hands moved with practiced precision, the same way he used to review contracts or scan balance sheets. When he finished, he stared at the cash, then snapped the wallet shut with a sharp motion. He leaned back against the leather seat, his jaw clenched. The young man's face returned to his mind, the hollow cheeks, the dark eyes that still carried some strange light. Richard could not shake the image of him walking away without a word of expectation. No request for food. No angle, no scam, just a simple return and a reminder to keep it safe. Richard had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something. Employees who smiled in his presence, investors who praised his vision, friends who disappeared the moment he stopped paying for the dinner. Since the accident, since his wife and daughter were gone, his world had shrunk even smaller. Wealth had only built walls higher around him. Trust was a currency he had stopped trading long ago, so why had this stranger done the opposite of what everyone else would have done? That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse apartment. The city lights stretched wide beyond the tall windows. He poured himself a drink, let the ice clink in the glass, and turned on the television. The noise filled the room, but his mind stayed elsewhere. He saw the stranger again, the worn jacket, the empty hands, the way he had smiled faintly before leaving. Richard felt unsettled, almost irritated, by the fact that he couldn't dismiss it. The next day he found himself back at Riverside Park. He told his driver to wait, then walked alone down the same path. He sat on a bench not far from where it had happened. The air was cooler, the wind sharper. Richard pulled his coat tight and scanned the park. He did not see the young man at first. Children ran past, and a group of teenagers gathered near the fountain. Richard waited, pretending to check his phone, but his eyes searched constantly. Finally, near the far edge of the park, he spotted him. The young man sat cross-legged on the grass, his back against a tree, a paper cup in his hands. Richard studied him from a distance. The man sipped carefully, cradling the cup with both hands as though it were fragile. A small bag sat at his feet, worn and half-torn, probably holding everything he owned. Every so often, someone passed by, but no one stopped to speak to him. He seemed invisible to the world around him. Richard stayed until the chill drove him back to the car. He said nothing to his driver, just instructed him to circle the park again the next day. This became a routine. For a week, Richard returned each afternoon. He watched quietly from different benches, always keeping distance. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. He wanted to understand what kind of man had returned the wallet untouched. On the third day, Richard saw the man, Daniel, speaking to an older woman with tangled hair and a thin coat. They sat together on a bench, and Richard noticed Daniel pulling something from his bag, a small sandwich wrapped in crumpled paper. He handed half of it to the woman without hesitation. She accepted it with trembling hands. Daniel smiled, faint, almost shy, then ate the other half himself. Richard felt something twist in his chest. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, gripping his cane tighter than he needed to. He told himself not to romanticize it. Maybe the young man was trying to impress the woman, maybe it was habit, or pride, or some trick he could not yet see. But as the days passed, the pattern repeated. Daniel shared what little he had. Sometimes it was food, sometimes just conversation, but always with a quiet gentleness that Richard had not expected. On the sixth day, Richard returned earlier. The park was nearly empty, the sky heavy with gray clouds. He found Daniel sitting alone this time, a book in his lap. The cover was worn, the pages bent. Richard leaned forward on his cane, trying to make out the title, but it was too far away. Daniel turned each page slowly, his lips moving slightly as he read. Richard exhaled through his nose. A homeless man reading. It shouldn't have surprised him, yet it did. He thought of all the men he had encountered in boardrooms, men with suits and degrees, men who spoke in polished sentences yet carried nothing but self-interest. Compared to them, this stranger looked poor, even broken, but somehow more genuine. That evening, Richard sat again in his penthouse, the silence louder than usual. He poured another drink but didn't touch it. The city stretched outside, glowing with wealth and noise. None of it meant anything in that moment. His thoughts circled back to the park, to the young man with the steady eyes and quiet strength. Richard felt conflicted. Curiosity was pulling him closer each day, but mistrust held him back. Experience told him that everyone wanted something. Experience told him that kindness often had a hidden cost, and yet he could not reconcile that belief with what he had seen. He sat down at his desk, opened the wallet again and stared at the bills. His reflection looked back at him from the polished surface. He remembered Daniel's words, "You should keep it safe." A simple phrase, almost nothing at all, but it had lingered in his mind longer than any contract or deal he had ever signed. Richard closed the wallet with a slow, deliberate motion. He set it on the desk and leaned back in his chair. The weight in his chest was not relief, not suspicion, but something closer to hope. It unsettled him as much as it comforted him. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. His driver waited downstairs, but Richard didn't give him instructions right away. He stood by the window, looking out at the city. Finally he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Back to Riverside." The driver nodded without question. As the car pulled away, Richard sat in silence, his hands resting on the cane beside him. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he would do. All he knew was that he could not stay away. The sky over Riverside Park was gray that afternoon, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The air felt damp, clinging to the skin, and most of the usual visitors had stayed away. Only a few scattered people moved along the paths, their coats pulled tight, their heads bent down against the chill. Richard Thompson sat on his usual bench, his cane resting beside him, his eyes fixed on the far side of the park. He had been coming here nearly every day, and though he never admitted it to himself, he was waiting for the same young man. His chest tightened when he finally spotted him. Daniel Carter sat on a bench not far from the fountain. His back was slightly curved, his shoulders tense from the cold. In his hands he held a piece of bread, the kind sold cheap at corner bakeries when it had gone stale. He bit into it slowly, chewing with patience as though stretching out every mouthful. His face looked tired, but his expression remained calm. Richard leaned forward. Something in the simplicity of it caught him. A man eating stale bread in silence, with no one beside him, seemed to carry more weight than the noise of any boardroom he had ever entered. Then Richard saw her. An older woman shuffled toward the bench, her body wrapped in a thin coat several sizes too big. Her hair was tangled beneath a faded scarf. She lowered herself onto the far edge of the bench, her hands trembling as she rubbed them together for warmth. Her eyes kept drifting toward the bread in Daniel's hands, though she tried to look away quickly each time. Richard's grip on his cane tightened. He watched closely, his breath caught in his throat. Daniel noticed her glances. He looked down at the bread, then back at her. Without hesitation, he broke the piece in half. He held out one portion toward her, his voice quiet but steady. "Here, you should eat." The woman's lips parted in surprise. For a second she didn't move, as if uncertain whether to accept. Then she reached out with shaking hands and took it. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice raw. She bit into the bread, her eyes closing as if even this stale food brought comfort. Daniel smiled faintly and began to eat his half. He did not look for praise, did not linger on her gratitude. It was as though giving came as naturally as breathing. Richard sat frozen, his chest felt heavy, his heartbeat louder than the faint rustle of leaves around him. The cane pressed hard into his palm. He had expected many things when he started following this young man. He had prepared himself to uncover a trick, a flaw, some hidden angle. What he saw instead was simple and undeniable. He whispered under his breath, "Why would he do that?" The words were not filled with suspicion this time, but with something closer to awe. For years Richard had lived in a mansion where meals were delivered hot by staff, where leftovers were thrown away without thought. He had watched associates waste money on luxuries that meant nothing, and he had done the same. Yet here in the middle of a cold park, a man with nothing had chosen to give half of what little he had to someone in need. The silence around him grew sharper. He could hear his own breathing, slow and uneven. His eyes stayed locked on Daniel, who now leaned back slightly on the bench, talking quietly with the woman as they ate. Richard saw how Daniel's shoulders relaxed, how his tone softened. There was no performance, no audience, it was genuine. Richard felt something stir inside him that he had not felt in years. It was uncomfortable, almost painful, like a long-forgotten memory rising to the surface. He thought of his wife, who used to keep blankets in the trunk of her car to hand out in winter. He thought of his daughter, who once insisted on donating her birthday money to a shelter. They had believed in kindness, and for a long time he had too. But since losing them, he had buried that belief under layers of suspicion and bitterness. Now watching Daniel, it returned. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, but the image would not leave. A young man in rags, giving away his food. A woman frail and hungry, finding relief in the smallest act. It was so far from the cold boardrooms and endless numbers that had defined his life. And yet it felt more real than anything he had touched in decades. When he opened his eyes again, Daniel was still there, still eating slowly beside the woman, his expression calm, his posture steady. Richard studied every detail, the way Daniel listened when the woman spoke, the way he nodded gently to her words. Nothing about him suggested a man broken beyond repair. He looked like a man holding on, even with nothing left. Richard exhaled deeply. The sound startled him in the quiet air. He adjusted his coat and forced himself to sit straighter, though his chest felt heavier with every passing second. He realized then that this was not about curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. The clouds above shifted, and a light drizzle began to fall. People hurried out of the park, pulling up their hoods. Richard stayed seated, his eyes locked on the bench where Daniel and the woman continued to share their bread, unbothered by the rain. For the first time in years Richard felt a crack in the walls he had built around himself. He did not trust easily. He did not allow anyone close. But as he watched Daniel, soaked by the rain yet still offering kindness, he understood one thing with complete clarity. This man was different, and no amount of money could ever buy what he had just witnessed. The drizzle had passed by morning, leaving the park damp and quiet. Patches of wet leaves clung to the benches and puddles reflected the gray sky above. Richard Thompson stood near the same path where he had spent the last week watching. Today, though, he was not content to sit and observe. Today he had made a decision. He spotted Daniel again on the far bench. The young man was huddled in his jacket, his shoulders drawn tight against the cold. His hair was damp and his shoes looked even more worn after the rain. He held nothing in his hands this time, only sat quietly with his gaze on the ground. Richard's heart pounded harder than he expected as he crossed the path. He tightened his grip on the cane, steadying each step. When he stopped in front of the bench, Daniel looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, uncertain. Richard cleared his throat. "Mind if I sit here?" His voice came out rougher than intended. Daniel hesitated, then shifted slightly to make room. "Go ahead." Richard lowered himself onto the bench, careful with his movements. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind moving through the branches. Richard glanced at Daniel, then straight ahead at the fountain. "I owe you something," Richard said finally. "You returned my wallet last week. Every dollar still inside." Daniel's expression remained calm. "It wasn't mine, that's all." "That's all." Richard turned his head, studying him. "You could have kept it, no one would have stopped you." Daniel looked down at his hands, clasped together. "Doesn't matter, it wasn't mine to take." His tone was simple, without pride. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He tapped the cane once against the ground, gathering his thoughts. Then he asked, "Have you eaten today?" Daniel shook his head slightly, as though it were not important. "I'll manage." Richard pushed himself up with effort. "Come with me. There's a diner down the street. Let me buy you a meal." Daniel stared at him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why?" "Because I want to." Richard replied, steady but not forceful. Nothing more. After a moment's pause, Daniel stood. His posture was wary but hunger outweighed hesitation. They walked together down the street until the neon sign of Harper's Diner came into view. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. A waitress greeted them with a smile and led them to a booth near the window. Richard settled into the seat, placing his cane beside him, while Daniel slid into the opposite side. The waitress poured coffee for both. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug, grateful for the heat. He kept his eyes low until the menus arrived. "Order whatever you like," Richard said, his voice firm. Daniel scanned the menu, his lips pressing together. He finally ordered a plate of eggs, toast, and bacon. Richard ordered the same, though he rarely ate heavy meals anymore. When the waitress left, Richard leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, his expression serious. "My name is Richard Thompson. You may not recognize it, but I've spent my life building companies. Real estate mostly. For years I was surrounded by money, people who wanted it, and people who pretended to care. But none of them stayed when my wife and daughter died. Since then it's just been me." Daniel looked up slowly. His brow furrowed, and his voice was quiet. "I'm sorry for your loss." Richard nodded once, the words hitting deeper than expected. "I don't tell people that. I don't trust easily. But when you handed me that wallet, untouched, I realized something. Money I have in plenty. What I don't have is trust, or kindness. And you reminded me that it still exists." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to say. He took a sip of coffee to cover the silence. His hands trembled slightly, whether from nerves or hunger. Their food arrived, breaking the moment. Daniel hesitated only a second before digging in, eating with careful restraint, though every bite seemed to restore him. Richard watched quietly, taking smaller bites himself. When Daniel finally slowed, Richard spoke again. "You were an honest man when you had nothing. That tells me more about you than any resume. Tell me, what did you do before this?" Daniel set down his fork, his eyes steady now. "I was a mechanical engineer, worked at Midtown Steel. Lost the job when the plant cut back. Then my mother got sick. Hospital bills, I couldn't keep up. Lost everything after she passed." Richard exhaled slowly, nodding. The story was too familiar in a country where debt destroyed families. He tapped the table lightly with one finger. "If you had the chance to work again, would you take it?" Daniel's eyes flickered with surprise. "Work? Work? Yes," Richard said firmly. "I can arrange something. A maintenance position at one of my companies. It's not glamorous, but it uses your skills, and I can see you have discipline." He paused, watching Daniel's reaction. "I can also provide a small apartment, somewhere to start again. Clean clothes, a bed, a door that locks. Everyone deserves at least that much." Daniel stared at him, his face caught between disbelief and caution. "Why me?" "Because you proved yourself when no one was watching," Richard answered, his voice lowered, more personal now. "Because you reminded me of the man I used to be." The booth fell silent. Daniel leaned back, his hands resting on the table, his mind racing. He could not ignore the offer, but he also could not understand why a stranger, wealthy or not, would extend it to him. His jaw tightened as he measured his words. "I don't want charity." "It isn't charity," Richard said, "it's a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Daniel searched his face for any sign of deceit. What he saw instead was sincerity, edged with loneliness. Finally he nodded once. "All right, I'll take the chance." Richard's shoulders relaxed, though he didn't show relief in words. He simply picked up his coffee again, his hand steadier now. From that day, things began to change. Richard arranged the job quietly, making calls from his office with the authority that still carried weight in the business world. Daniel reported to work the following week, dressed in new clothes Richard had insisted on buying. He threw himself into the tasks, repairing machinery, inspecting systems, proving quickly that his skills had not faded. Richard visited often, walking the factory floor with his cane, watching Daniel move among the workers. He noticed how Daniel treated people, with respect, with patience. No arrogance, no shortcuts. It impressed him more than he admitted aloud. Outside of work, Richard made sure the apartment was ready. A modest place, but clean, safe, with heat that worked and a bed that did not sag. When Daniel unlocked the door for the first time, Richard stood back, pretending not to watch the way relief crossed the young man's face. As weeks passed, the two men met often. Sometimes at the diner, sometimes at the park. They spoke more each time. Richard found himself listening, in a way he had not done for years. Daniel talked about his mother, about the plant, about the weight of starting over. Richard shared little pieces of his own life, fragments of memory he had kept locked away. The distance between them shrank. What began with suspicion shifted towards something that felt almost like family. Months passed, and the factory floor no longer looked at Daniel Carter as a newcomer. He had proven himself with steady hands and sharp focus. Machines that others ignored were repaired under his care. Workers who had grown used to supervisors barking orders noticed the way he spoke with respect, no matter the task. By the third month, Daniel was no longer the man sitting alone on a park bench. His clothes were clean, his frame a little stronger from regular meals, his posture more upright. Yet he never acted as if he had risen above anyone. He showed up early, stayed late, and always offered a hand when someone needed help. The crew began greeting him with nods and trust, small signs that meant more than any title. Richard Thompson visited often. At first he came with his cane and sharp eyes, observing from a distance, but over time, his presence changed. He stopped looking for flaws, and instead found himself smiling quietly when he saw Daniel laugh with the others. In the evenings, Richard would drive Daniel back to the modest apartment he had arranged for him, sometimes joining him at the diner afterward. The conversations grew longer, the silences less guarded. For Richard, the loneliness of his penthouse no longer pressed as heavily. He still returned each night to empty rooms, but now there was a reason to leave them again in the morning. His days were no longer filled only with meetings and numbers. He had someone he wanted to see, someone who reminded him that life could be simple and honest again. One evening, Richard hosted a small dinner at his home. He had not done so in years. Daniel sat at the long table, unsure at first, but Richard waved off his hesitation. "This house hasn't heard real conversation in too long," he said, his eyes soft. The two men ate together, their voices carrying through halls that had been silent since the accident. It was after that dinner that Richard began thinking about what he had left to give. His fortune meant little without someone to share it with. His family was gone, but he could not ignore the bond forming with the young man who had entered his life by chance. Weeks later, on a cool autumn afternoon, Richard asked Daniel to meet him at Riverside Park. The trees were just beginning to turn again, the leaves bright with color. They walked slowly toward the same bench where Daniel had once returned the wallet. Richard leaned heavily on his cane, but his expression was lighter than Daniel had ever seen. They sat down together. For a moment neither spoke, the sound of children playing in the distance filling the silence. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on the fountain ahead. "This is where it started," Richard said quietly. "You handed me my wallet, every bill still inside. You could have walked away with it, and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't." Daniel lowered his gaze. It was the right thing to do. Richard turned toward him. His eyes were steady now, his voice firm. "Since then, you've shown me something I thought I had lost forever. Trust, kindness. I built an empire, Daniel, but when I lost my family none of it mattered. I stopped believing in people. You changed that." Daniel's chest tightened. He listened, unsure where the words were leading, but the weight in Richard's tone held him still. Richard gripped the head of his cane. His hand trembled slightly, but his words did not. "I've been alone for too long. And I don't want to leave this world with nothing but empty rooms and silent halls. You have given me back something I thought was gone. If you're willing, I would like to call you my son. I want to make it official. I want you to inherit not just what I own, but what I have left of a family." The words hung in the air. Daniel felt his throat close. His eyes stung as he looked at the older man beside him. He saw not the billionaire he had once feared, but a father asking for connection. "I don't know what to say," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Say yes," Richard replied softly, His lips curved into a faint smile, the first true smile in years. Daniel covered his face with his hands for a moment, his shoulders shaking. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet. "Yes," he said. His voice was unsteady, but filled with certainty. "Yes, I would be honored." Richard reached out, placing a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of everything he had longed to give. They sat there as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, warming the damp ground around them. For the first time in years, Richard felt whole again, and for Daniel the ache of loss and exile eased, replaced by something he thought he would never find again: a family, a place to belong. That evening, as they left the park side by side, the future no longer looked empty. Daniel was no longer a man adrift, and Richard was no longer a man alone. Their lives, once broken in separate ways, had joined together on the same bench where it all began.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.